Welcome to our talk, the place where we agree to disagree. Today, my guest is Bhante Sukhachito, a monk currently in London, and our topic is bypassing. Hallo Bhante, ich grüße dich. I'm sorry we have to speak in English, of course. I hope I did the introduction in English, did I?
You did.
Lucky me. Normally, Bhante and we speak in German, most of the times at least. Bhante is German originally. How are you today? And you are in London, aren't you?
No, I'm not in London. I'm in the southwest of the county of Devon, which is southwest, the wet part of England, at about 150 miles, 200 plus kilometers from London.
Okay, fine. I wasn't all that wrong, but a little bit wrong. I'd like to introduce you, Bhante, to our viewers first. And dear viewers, Bhante Sukhachito has been an ordained monk of the Theravada tradition since 1990 and a teacher in Insight Dialogue for 12 years. Bhante is somewhat of a traveling monk in my eyes, since I have seen him travel to different continents. He is teaching or was teaching in North America, in southern parts of Africa, and of course all over Europe. Originally, he became a monk in Thailand, where he stayed at the monastery back in the 1980s. In his experience, to quote him, interpersonal meditation, insight dialogue, is an extremely helpful aid for the development of wholesome qualities. It bridges the gap between traditional silent meditation and our everyday lives, including relationships with other people. Bhante and I have known each other for 20 years. Bypassing has been a subject, I think, ever since we got to know each other. Although the terminology bypassing, I didn't know at all until very recently. So, Bhante, is that fair enough an introduction? Have I forgotten?
Maybe it should be clear, but maybe it's worthwhile to mention that I'm a monk in the Buddhist tradition, because some people might wonder, you didn't mention that.
I beg your pardon, and I'm glad you corrected that. This is how one works when one takes things for granted. Your robe, of course, would be somewhat of a giveaway for most people, but you're quite right. Not everybody necessarily knows that. I welcome you, Bhante. How did we get to talk? How did we choose the word bypassing, the topic? Can you remember? Can you say a few things about that?
Yes, I can indeed. My memory fails more and more. I have more and more senior moments in my life, but I can remember that quite clearly because when you invited me for this art talk, you basically invited me to think about a topic. And a topic which is very alive for me since a number of years, and I've talked on this topic quite a bit in different locations, not so much quite a bit, but end of this month I give another talk on this topic. It's called spiritual bypassing. For me as a Buddhist monk, of course, spiritual practices, meditation, cultivation of one's own life, character, mind, consciousness, and so on, is a central part. But bypassing, of course, is much more, or spiritual bypassing is just, a fraction of our life. Bypassing can happen in all areas of our life. And for me, it seems so important to life in general to look at those areas where we don't want to look, where we want to avoid. And, when I hear that word bypassing, I think about a bypass operation, a heart operation. My father had it also in the early 2000s, which is extremely helpful. Something is blocked and you put a new, way, around it that it flows again. So it's not per se all that negative, I think. It has to be really investigated deeply. And in what areas do we do this consciously? In what areas are we blind? And it's, of course, when we look at our blindnesses, how can we know about our blindnesses? It's blind. We don't know. So sometimes the help of the other, the good friend, the Reiki master, our partner, our children, our parents, our good friends can be so helpful, can't they?
Yeah, I agree with you. We often have blind spots, and bypassing can be very tricky. And I'm glad you used the terminology spiritual bypassing. Originally, we said, or you suggested the terminology spiritual bypassing, and I then more or less insisted on reducing it to bypassing only. And you already brought it up. It is it is something which happens in many aspects of life. And in fact, the terminology psychological bypassing also exists. In fact, I looked it up a moment ago, and here is what the psychologist would say. Ironically, self-actualization or self-actualizing, people are the ones who suffer here due to taking this bypass away from reality. Instead of just plain living, they analyze life psychologically. And I guess in terms of spiritual bypass, only the last word changes. Psychologically is being replaced by spiritually. In my research, I came across a very interesting young woman. I was shocked to see that she's only the age of my sons. And her first well-known video goes back to 2014. She was only 30 then. And she spoke about spiritual bypassing. Her name is Teal Swan. I have taken a few video clips. Maybe we look at some of them. And she spoke about that already some time ago. And she put it in a holistic context. She didn't reduce it just to spirituality. She said very often we bypass spirituality through physical activities. So that's like a cop-out. And interestingly, in one passage she said, and I wonder, Bhante, whether you see that similarly, she was referring to the very Catholic tradition of confession. And she said that can be a way of bypassing by simply going to, the booth where you do the confession and load your sins, your ill doings there, and say 3 prayers, walk out, and it's all forgotten. What do you say? Is that practice also a form of bypassing?
Could be, but maybe before I try to answer to that question you were pointing to, is maybe allow me just to say, when I use the word spiritual, people might misunderstand in terms of limiting only to religious spiritual practices and so, but by spiritual I really mean the development in our whole life, holistic approach to life. How do we grow in life? How do we use life to learn, to develop more wholesome qualities? It's not just, when you pray or meditate or do some kind of, go to church or visit spiritual centers or go on retreat or on a fast or whatever. I really mean, how do you live your life? How do you develop your spirit, basically? Which direction are you going in your life? That's what I mean, spiritual, because often spiritual practices or religious practices are so limited to formal acts of practice. But most of our life, we just live life, right? Engage in our profession, do things. And this is what the main spiritual practice, I think, is, So in our Buddhist monastic tradition, we have also this practice of confession. Every fortnight, the monks get together and we recite our rules. And before we do that, we confess to each other. But it's not done in the spirit of, that the other person forgives us per se, but it's really the invitation to look at your life in a way. In the topic of bypassing is acknowledge what I have done wrong. where I have transgressed rules. What was my unskillful behavior? So I share this with my monk brother, and there's a formula in our Buddhist scriptural language, Pali language it's called, where actually you acknowledge the mistake, the wrongdoing you have done, and you also have the clear intention of not doing it again. Basically, you acknowledge something unskillful done, and I have the sincere intention not doing it again, And unless it's a very heavy offense, the other person just listens compassionately and confirms, something like that. So in the Catholic tradition, I think often it's understood like, you get is the English word absolution or something? You give your sins and you have to change, To dwell always on the past, on the mistakes, that doesn't help, You have to make a sincere effort to change.
I think that you're picking up on a definition of bypassing, which has to do with avoidance, with neglecting, with pushing aside. And you're saying when you do, let me call it true confession, and that happens also in Catholicism, of course, you repent and you become clear about your transgression. You don't delegate the absolution to an outer authority. You're actually staying within yourself. And I haven't been to a booth in a Catholic church for a long time doing confession. But in principle, I think it is a wonderful practice because in modern times, more modern times, my last confessions I did, not as a schoolboy, but later when I was a young man, it was a dialogue. And I found it had almost like a good psychotherapist, the priest, asked the right questions, inducing me to reflect. But at the end of the day, he didn't really comment, "Oh, bad, and now you're resolved." But it's a dialogue very much in the sense which you explained.
Maybe when I can just jump in here, maybe I can encourage you as a good friend. Go again, do it again.
I've got you. I come to you, Bhante. We've had so many walks together which have served a very similar thing. And you picking up earlier something important. A good friend will actually reflect also back to give you light onto your blind spots. And one very common bypassing technique or daily occurrence is when people meet each other, and it's simpler to simply agree with their rubbish by either not commenting it or just nodding it. That's much easier done than actually saying, "Oh, let's think about that. Let's talk about that because I'm not sure I agree."
Excuse me, René, we were interrupted again. You noticed that?
Yeah.
So you pick up, I forgot actually where we were interrupted.
That's okay. Let me do something else then. I have prepared these videos. Should we look at one of them and look at the definition of this young lady, and then we continue our conversation? Let's have a look.
Spiritual bypassing is the cancer of the spiritual world. It's a disease that has run rampant in both religious and non-religious circles. Spiritual bypassing is the act of using spiritual beliefs to avoid your unmet needs, deep pain, and unresolved wounds. Spiritual bypassing is a form of avoidance. Because it's a form of avoidance, it's a form of resistance. Spiritual bypassing is in fact the shadow side of spirituality. The spiritual beliefs of any spiritual tradition, be it Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, New Age, Islamic, or even self-help, can provide ample justification for living in a state of inauthenticity. They can all provide justification for avoiding the unwanted aspects of one's own feelings and state of being in favor of what one considers to be a more enlightened state. Even the non-affiliated, unanimously beloved saying, "Keep calm and carry on," is a glorification of spiritual bypassing. Some examples of spiritual bypassing include anger phobia, exaggerated detachment, emotional numbing and repression, blind or overly tolerant compassion, weak or too porous boundaries, using cognitive reasoning to escape emotional feelings, debilitating judgment about one's negativity or shadow side, devaluation of the personal relative to the spiritual, avoidance of physical, day-to-day life, delusions of having arrived at a higher level of being, and my personal least favorite, overemphasis of and attachment to the positive, to the degree that there is a high level of resistance to anything negative.
How did you feel with this video clip?
I am used to be very critical, Rennie, as you know, and I have to say, what this woman shared, I have to agree 100%, or maybe 98, 99%, you know. I mean, she spoke a bit fast for my taste, you know, and in that short clip, a lot of information, which is really valuable, but I must say, she is right. I agree.
Yeah, and I, of course, do her injustice because I show a 60-second clip of a 7-minute video, which I will put in the description of this video of ours, so people can go and look it up, and maybe we revisit another clip later on. I found it interesting, also her very end, where she's criticizing what many people call positive thinking. She's basically saying if we're there is a way of escapism into positive thinking, where we basically just substitute one positive sounding ideology or belief system with a negative sounding one. But we haven't really changed anything. We're just relabeling something unresolved. So how do you, where are you in terms of, I mean, you exude with the robe, you exude peacefulness, harmony, all these wonderful serenity, all these wonderful attributes. And very often people tend to take rescue in these attitudes, but in an artificial way, in an escapist kind of way. So you must have had a lot of thought about these things.
Yeah, first of all, I want to point out that whatever she or other people mention, you know, what can be spiritual or bypassing or spiritual bypassing doesn't have to be. It depends. For one person, it might very well be bypassing, and for the other person, it's just the right way to meet life or to meet the challenges of life or to do useful things, skillful things. Yeah, so, you know, whatever list you mentioned, what bypassing or spiritual bypassing can be, it can be or it cannot be. It depends on the circumstances, on the person, on your motivation, and so on, you know. And like what you were pointing to earlier, people project a lot into other people, right? You as a Reiki teacher, master, you know, for me as a spiritual monk. And of course, it's totally understandable that at times in life, or maybe many times in life, the problems, the suffering, the challenges are just so much. I mean, just look what happened since, you know, nearly 2 weeks now, you know, this horrible war in the Ukraine, you know, and people are shattered, you know, for such a long time, not counting the conflict in Yugoslavia or former Yugoslavia, maybe in Central Europe, we were more or less protected from a war which was so close, you know. So people are not used when such a big challenge, such huge suffering is so close, you know. When we had this huge wave of refugees coming into Europe, that was one thing. But now these are refugees coming from so close, you can say. So when suffering gets so immense, so overwhelming, a natural tendency to be not overwhelmed is, I want to shut off. I want to, you know, escape, whatever, to listen to beautiful music, to a nice prayer, positive thinking, meditating, watching my breath, doing a Reiki treatment, who knows what, you know, to bear with a huge amount of discomfort and being overwhelmed. Yeah, totally understandable. But when this is our main strategy to meet difficulties in life, you know, As soon as things get difficult, I turn to the positive thoughts. I go to my place in nature. I do this or that. I go to the prayer, Then it can become bypassing, I think.
I
And
think the operative word is can be. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go on.
no. And in a way, I must say I'm very grateful. And we know each other long enough. We have sometimes periods where things are going pretty well in life. That's for me right now the case. But I've had long periods of, very difficult patches of life. Being depressed, having to deal with a lot of inner conflicts, what I call the torn heart. You know what I'm referring to. I don't need to put out all my dirty laundry here in this talk, But we all have our challenges. And in a way, these challenges I consider often as the growing area of our life, our best teachers. If things would always go nicely, smooth, happy, happy-go-lucky or something like that, we wouldn't grow so much, I think, in terms of understanding, compassion, wisdom, kindness, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, being balanced in life.
You said something very interesting referring to the Ukrainian war. I want to show something which I just 10 minutes ago, before we started speaking, I saw in the newspaper as a headline. This emotion about one's own peacefulness. We are horrified by the war against Ukraine, but some of us celebrate above all our own moralistic purity. So we bathe ourselves, this is my take of what this says, we bathe ourselves in our moral, ethical, superior role, and we point fingers at others almost. So this to me seems to be an acute bypassing which happens not just amongst spiritually inclined or aware people, but politicians, the people at large at this moment. And it ties in with what you said, this escape to positive thinking, this escape and these projections onto you representing a intact spiritual presence, and then projecting all kinds of assumptions onto you. You know what I mean with the moral high road being taken currently by a lot of people with respect to the war, and almost buying themselves a good excuse for not making clear statements where they are, like you did earlier, where you clearly said you are in favor of peace, and that the war basically is a bad thing happening. So how often do you meet people within your own community, amongst within the monastery, within monks, where you see the same escapism from the real world today?
Let me, before I try to answer that question, just say I think bypassing can easily happen, or more easily happen, when we take sides. This is my position, this is right, that is wrong. And let me quote, that I was distracted earlier, quote a very famous Buddhist teacher who just passed away a few months ago, Thich Nhat Hanh. So the quote goes like this, it's short. It's about peace. The situation of the world is like this. People completely identify with one side, one ideology. To understand the suffering and the fear of the human being who thinks differently, we have to become one with him or her. To do so is dangerous. We will be suspected by both sides. But if we don't do it, if we align ourselves with one side or the other, we will lose our chance to work for peace. Reconciliation is to understand both sides. So I think this is a very, very important principle, and the word reconciliation, I know, Rene, you are so active in the Reiki world for reconciliation and in other areas in life, So coming to your question, what do I experience in monasteries and in monastic communities. And again, I don't have to look much outside. I just have to look here in my own heart and life. This lifestyle of a Theravada Buddhist monk is ideal. It's a perfect scenario for bypassing. You are, basically free from responsibilities in terms of relationship, dealing with money. You don't have to engage deeply with other people. You have to follow a monastic routine. You're protected from women most of the time. I mean, there's so many areas with our lifestyle, if we keep to the rules, perfectly avoiding things. So potentially perfectly bypassing things, especially spiritual bypassing also. And many people, of course, say, the way you live is totally weird. You must get sick, not living a relationship, not having sex, not having money directly or dealing with money, And I have to say, and again, I'm not excluding myself or, every time I point to somebody else, Rene does this. You should be aware, always 3 finger at least point to yourself, So it says often more about yourself than the other person. So if I say that monk has that problem, monastic communities, I would even say spiritual communities, are often the perfect place for very traumatized people to come to, and especially monastic communities, I would say, or very dedicated spiritual people, or, are likely to come from a very wounded place in their lives, distressed, disturbed, whatever, traumatized. This thing is. So it's not easy, in my experience, to use this lifestyle, to live this lifestyle without bypassing. You really need to be very attentive, very careful. And I would say you need spiritual friends, good friends, who point you to the blind spots where you do bypass, where you don't see, where you avoid unskillfully. I don't know if that answers a bit your question.
It does. And actually, it occurred to me that I had the privilege of working with a lot of nuns in Catholicism as a Reiki teacher in monasteries. And of course, there are micro societies which are a reflection of society at large with a different emphasis. And you just reminded me of that. And something very profound happened in me when you spoke about monastic or life in monastery, where you described to some extent that the challenges with bypassing and so on are the same, if not more, because of the environment, because you have a setting which induces you to do a degree of escapism from one's own trauma. And then you said that maybe this is, for many people, the very reason why they chose that life. It reminded me of the many nuns I had the privilege with, and it opened my heart to look at nuns, monks with a compassion which I wasn't quite aware of before you spoke about primarily about yourself, but representing, I'm sure, many other nuns and monks who are in a similar situation. And at the end of the day, compassion is almost like the reverse of projection. And I think this is such an important observation in today's time and age, and with the conflict going on, that we need to point the finger at ourselves, like you said, and find compassion for anyone out there and for anyone in here.
So where does bypassing or non-bypassing, where does war, where does peace start, It's always here, in a way, So as long as you used the word resistance before, and that, or in one of the quotes, I think, that word with resistance appeared, and one of my main practices in life is to work with resistance, with not liking things. And I really like, there's a teaching, you can say, from the Buddhist tradition, which says suffering equals like pain. Pain is an umbrella term for any difficult situations, physical, psychological, pain, multiplied by resistance. So, in other words, I repeat, suffering equals pain multiplied by resistance. So what happens when there's no resistance?
The pain evaporates?
No.
Tell me.
No, the pain is still there. There's no resistance. Like, I have a lot of knee pain because of my osteoarthritis, for instance, If I have a lot of resistance to that, I have huge suffering, But if there's no resistance, the pain is still there, but the mind, the heart is basically free from suffering, I accept it. No resistance. I'm kind to it, maybe. Oh, thank you, knee, that you are still at least the way you function now, even if it's not 100% or like it used to be 5 or 10 years ago, Even Reiki, doesn't do miracles.
And of course, I
disagree.
No. I agree. I agree. If anything, I would add, maybe that is true. So maybe miracles happen sometimes. But then we would have another conversation about the terminology of what is a miracle. Let's leave that for another day. I thank you very much for having joined me, Sukhajito. We're coming to an end. I think towards the end, you touched on a very important point. I'm not going to show any more videos. I will send you the link to the whole video. I hope you will, I am sure, discover that this young lady said a lot of things which you also said today. But I'm not going to close off without giving you an opportunity to have a final say.
Thank you, Rene, for inviting me for this talk or exchange. And I would like to close with encouraging each one of you. Basically, I speak to myself, of course. Do have, the courage, the humility, the honesty, the integrity to look at those areas in your life where you don't want to look, where you don't want to, experience, where you don't want to feel. Because there's a saying, the quietest place in a hurricane is the eye of the hurricane. So maybe the most peaceful place in life is in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our challenge, in the midst of those things, those very things we want to avoid. And I just want to basically encourage you to empower yourself. You have the ability to do it. Many skillful things, spiritual teachings, Reiki, prayer, whatever might be helpful for you. Find those helps, find those practices, those things which are helpful and useful in your life. That's maybe my final statement.
Thank you very much. Wise words for our closing. Thank you, Bhante, for having joined me. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon again in person.
Hope so. If we're still alive, not sure. Thank you so much, Rene. Best wishes.
Thank you. Dear viewers, thank you very much for viewing. We'll see each other in 3 weeks' time. Please subscribe and help us continue with the Art Talks. If you want to make a donation, I'm very welcome. Also for our translations of the videos. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.